Whoever's missing is missing.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Keisha, and I want to welcome you to today's discussion, March 2nd, 2019. And the discussion today will be led by DeJean. We have quite a bit to talk about today, but I just wanted to give a brief introduction and opening for Joel. And particularly, I wanted to make one key focal point, which is I want everyone to know that the LaRouche Political Action Committee has just released a new newsletter publication here called the Hamiltonian. And this Hamiltonian, we're calling on all activists, members, supporters, and the like to help us to distribute this. Let me just tell you about the importance of it. First of all, this newsletter actually features, as many people may know by now, the founder of our international organization, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, has passed away, and passed away on February 12th, just nearly 3 weeks ago. What this newsletter actually, the focal point of it is realizing the dream of all mankind, which was the dedication and the commitment of the life of Mr. LaRouche and his life's work and activity. What you will find in here is a beautiful, I'm holding this up here for everyone to see in the camera, obituary of the life of Mr. LaRouche, which has now been circulated, and it's being circulated by activists and supporters around the country and around the world in various newspapers across the country. And the obituary discusses the activities internationally and the life work of Mr. LaRouche with various international leaders, of civil rights leaders, and from 1922 to 2019 on his death. And it also has one of the beautiful condolence letters that was put forth by the Russian academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Mr. Sergei, take it away, please, Glaziev. And he writes about the contributions of Mr. LaRouche, and there are many such condolence letters and recognitions of the life's work of Mr. LaRouche by prominent figures. This one is titled "A Great Thinker of Our Time." And finally, the last two things that I want to get to, one is as a part of the campaign for realizing the life's work of Mr. LaRouche and his confrontations against those who have tried to act against the progress and the development of mankind. And we are going on a full-out offensive campaign on exonerating Mr. LaRouche and what he represents to the world, and shutting down not only the current operation and coup that's going on against the presidency of the United States, but against the 50 years of FBI targeting and destruction against the American people, and against cooperation and the building of positive relations among nations. And you will find the details in this newsletter, as well as where you can sign and circulate the exoneration petition for Mr. LaRouche, that President Trump, if he really wants to actually do what is right and get to justice for our nation and for the world, then the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche for the fabricated lies and operations that have been run against him, and that go back to the destructive policies in the 40 years, 50 years of the assassination of great leaders like President John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. This really gives you a sense of what the fight is that we're embarking on now. And it's not just on current events. The question is, where is our nation going? Where's the future of our nation going? And that gets me to my point of our discussion for today being led by Joel DeJean. And Joel DeJean has been a long-term collaborator and a member of the LaRouche movement. He has a background in engineering and has been doing a lot of work on the study of the fusion economy. The topic for today is going to be on the fusion economy, or for the future of mankind, or a new Green Deal that would plunge us into a dark age. And the real question is, which one will save you from an asteroid, or which one will save you from a blackout? And I can tell you, he's going to explain to you why it's not a new Green Deal, because that's not a deal at all. That is a dark age genocide. So, but one thing you should note is, in the context of Joel's presentation, one of the things that we have as ammunition to use in refuting this whole climate agenda is the final article in the Hamiltonian. We're starting to get out on university campuses across various political layers. It's called The New Green Deal, A Prescription for Suicide. And so they actually changed the title on me anyway. But it was a different title. So one thing you should know about that, I just want to make two more points on this whole operation and why it's so, this is an all-out fight in the fight for economic progress and for mankind, because I'll let Joel explain the implications of what this new Green Deal really means for the breakdown of civilization. But one thing you should know is that there was just a bill that was passed that was introduced in the Senate by Schumer, a Democrat of New York, and Mr. Carper, another Democrat, who with 47 signatures from House Democrats, saying that we have come to realize that, one, climate change is real, two, human beings are the cause of climate change, and basically, I don't have it in front of me, but three, we have to put in every effort to address this, the devastations of climate change. So this is what our Congress is focusing on right now, instead of the real solutions we should be focusing on, which is how do we increase the productivity through higher states of energy flux density of mankind, through higher states of creative development, through LaRouche's aspect of what he called for a all-out fusion economy based on the one of the principles of the 4 laws, which means that we have to go for higher and higher states of upshifts in the progress of mankind. And you can't do this if you have what's being pushed forth as what we saw today in recent reports, where it was questioned, what would the world look like without automobiles? What if we had everyone, riding skateboards and scooters, and that you did away with all diesel, all carbon, all natural gas, so forth and so on, and that we put everybody on a system where transportation, for instance, is based on, getting around on your scooter or your skateboard or roller skates or bicycle, or, what kind of idiotic madness are we dealing with? Roller skate. So you can see right now we are so needed. And the final thing that I wanted to say is, you think about that kind of economy based on the dark age conditions of a pre-industrial society, where you're going to go back to conditions where people don't have adequate electricity if you were to deal with things like the bombardment of solar flares and asteroids that would come and wipe the planet out, as Joel will discuss. You know, are we prepared? Do we have the infrastructure for that? You know, if we say total carbon, doing away with total carbon emissions, what is that going to lead to? And the bigger question is really expressed in the statement posed just yesterday in Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche's webcast that she gave, really focusing on this question of the future direction of mankind. And I'll make a quote from this and then leave it at that for Joel to develop a bit, where she says, if you look at the events of the world in the totality of all of the concerns and problems that we're facing, you know, from the question of Venezuela to North Korea, India, Pakistan, the whole of the situation in Southwest Asia, the situation is extremely fragile, as she says, and situation in Ukraine. And all of these are to lead to a potential toward, if not a final catastrophe, of a third world war, or what we may call the nuclear war. And the key thing right now is, how do you address all of these issues? What's the future of mankind? Well, she says, you have, given the fact that the old paradigm, the paradigm which is embedded in this new Green Deal and this geopolitical system and the British colonial system to keep nations and peoples pitted against each other and backwards, what is needed is to recognize that there are people and forces representing this old paradigm, as she says, that are pushing confrontation. And it is extremely important to recognize that either humanity moves to a completely new type of thinking, a new paradigm where you establish a new international relations which takes into account the security interests, the economic interests, and the political interests of all nations. The only way to do that is to establish a higher order of a system, a new paradigm which overcomes geopolitics and puts humanity as one first, and then all national and regional interests second. And you think about this from the standpoint of what's going on with the Belt and Road Initiative being pushed through by President Xi Jinping of China and joined by many nations right now, proposing the Belt and Road Initiative idea as a building of a community of shared interests for the future of mankind. So that's the real product of our discussion today. How do we go about getting more people to join us in building this community of shared interests for the future of mankind, not tearing each other apart like barbarians? So again, I'm going to reiterate this Hamiltonian, extremely important. People who can join us on college campuses to make sure that our young people are not being brainwashed by the insanity that wants to deny them a future, and getting it out far and wide. So again, that's what I wanted to stress for now, and let me go ahead and bring Joel up.
Tripwires.
Yeah. Okay, you got it.
Okay, next week will be the 150th anniversary of the periodic table of elements.
Really?
And Mendeleev put that out in 1869. Now, part of the Green New Deal will be to eliminate element 6. They will eliminate carbon and possibly replace it with a new element called the Cortez. So, Mike, if you could put up the picture of on February 7th, well-known climate scientist Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and her sidekick, Ed Markey, senator from Massachusetts, held a press conference where they presented this great Green New Deal. Now, who could be against the Green New Deal? Now, what they propose is that in 10 years we get rid of all carbon fuels, that we rely on 100% renewable energy, mostly windmills and solar panels and maybe a few dams. And most of the greenies are in favor of blowing up dams. So maybe we'll tolerate them for a little while. And the elimination of nuclear fission energy. Now, it's not just the Democrats, because Texas happens to be the biggest windbag in the United States. We have right now an installed capacity of 22 gigawatts of windmills. And if any of you had been to West Texas, you see these huge 300-foot wingspan windmills. And to date, we have 10,000 windmills in Texas alone. And the windmills are about 2.5 megawatts per windmill. Now, that's the capacity of the average windmill. Now, they use a trick in promoting Texas as the wind capital of the United States. And by the way, that program was started by another great genius, George W. Bush, who promoted wind power. And if you compare the output of a windmill farm, they call them windmill farms out there, with a typical nuclear fission reactor, which can produce 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Now, I just want to go through what is a watt, because they use a little sleight of hand to try to compare the two. Now, a watt, do you have a eraser up here? Like, whoops, oh, that's not. Okay, I'll use this. I'll use this as, pretend this is a stick of butter. Now, a watt is a unit of power, and power is energy divided by time in seconds. So if this was a stick of butter, which is about 0.1 kilogram or 0.22 pounds, and I raise it up 1 meter or 3.3 feet, that takes about 1 joule of energy to raise that. And if I drop it and it hits and turns into liquid butter, that produces, if I drop it in 1 second, that's equivalent to 1 watt of power.
Whoa.
Now, if you compare the capacity of a windmill, one of these 300-foot wingspan windmills in West Texas, it's rated at 2.5 megawatts. Now, that's supposedly enough to power over 1,000 homes. But in a Texas summer, that's about 200 homes with the air conditioning. But if you look at the windmill, the capacity is 2.5 megawatts. But if you look at your electric bill, you're billed on how many kilowatt hours you use. So for electricity, you have to produce 2.5 megawatts every second. For a whole hour, that's 3,600 seconds. So it's not just to look at what the capacity is, you have to look at what the availability is. And for a typical windmill, the availability is something like 30%. So over 2/3 of the time, you're producing 0 watts. Now, if you try to run your refrigerator 30% of the time, or your air conditioner 30% of the time, or your baby heart monitor 30% of the time, you're going to have to cover that 70% of dead time. Now, what they do here in Texas is we have plenty of gas. It's not just wind bags, it's gas bags. So using natural gas as a backup, for every watt of power that you have as your capacity, you have to have a backup of 1 watt equivalent, so that when the wind doesn't blow, you can keep generating power. Because the thing with the electric grid, and by the way, the U.S. electric grid is one of the marvels of the world. This is one of the biggest, most complex machines in history. And what Cortez and her cohorts are proposing is that we take down that wonder of the world and we go back to the average power usage in Africa. I was born in a country, Haiti, which has 10 watts per person available, as compared to over 1,000 watts available for the typical American. So if you look at what else they're proposing to eliminate air travel. But don't worry, we're going to build high-speed rail. Now, I don't know if she's aware of it, but the Chinese rail network is based on electric power. And you can't exactly run an electric train on windmills. They have a tough time getting through those tunnels. But if we were to build a high-speed rail, which we're in favor of, to connect the major cities in the United States, we would have to increase the power output by something like 350 gigawatts, which is almost half of the installed electric capacity in the United States. Now, how are you going to build the rails? How are you going to build the cement? How are you going to build the bridges? That's not explained. But in this Green New Deal, they have gone beyond a real genius, Einstein. Now, Einstein, for the last half of his life, was searching for a unified field theory. Well, Cortez and her friends have already figured out a unified field theory. It's called climate change. Because if you remember in 2011, when Texas went through a summer of drought, and it was 100 degrees for 30 days that summer, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We were told that this is proof positive of the effects of climate change. And a mere 6 years later, when we had the effects of Hurricane Harvey, where we had over 50 inches of rain in 1 week, we were told that this is proof positive of climate change. And I remember another cohort of Cortez, the columnist for the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, in 2007, and by the way, he is given credit for coining this Green New Deal. In 2007, he wrote in January of that year that he was able to play golf in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., because it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit in January. And his the column went through how children in the future will never know snow. They'll never see a winter. And next week they're expecting another polar vortex. And they're going to have snow and ice and minus temperatures again this year. But if you look at the so-called climate scientists, when we have a polar vortex, it's climate change. When we have a heat wave, it's climate change. When we have a drought, it's climate change. When we have flooding, it's climate change. When we have asteroids, and I actually heard Amy Goodman ask a climate scientist about this. We had a close call with an asteroid, and she actually asked the guy, does that have anything to do with climate change? So it can cover all earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, everything is covered by this theory. Now, the other option they go for is solar. Now, you know what killed Opportunity? The Mars rover. Mars rover died, or at least they gave it a burial last week. And it had gone around the Mars surface for 15 years, which was a good run. But unlike the Curiosity rover, Opportunity depends on solar power. And because of a giant dust storm, the panels were covered by dust. And it was so severe that it drained the batteries and we were no longer able to communicate with Opportunity. Whereas the nuclear-powered Curiosity is still going. So if you look at what happened in Minnesota about 4 weeks ago, they had the windmills because of the polar vortex and the freezing up of the bearings. They had zero output from the windmills. The solar panels they had were frozen solid, and it was cloud cover, so no output from the solar panels. The natural gas pumping stations began to freeze over. So they had to get the factories in Michigan to basically shut down and the factories in Minnesota to shut down so they would have enough natural gas to heat the homes. And they just barely missed having a total blackout in the Midwest. Hopefully they'll be a little luckier next week when they have the next polar vortex. So this is what we're facing if we're dependent on windmills and solar power. You have a backup, which a professor from Stanford proposed, that instead of just having batteries as backup, because it's very hard to upscale battery power as your backup. Because you know how difficult it is to keep your cell phones charged up. To scale up to the gigawatts is a tremendous challenge. So this guy proposed, well, that's easy. We'll build 600 Hoover-sized dams. And while the windmills are churning at night, where we don't need the electricity, we'll use the power to pump water uphill to a reservoir. And when the wind is not blowing, we can use the water, run it through water turbines and generate electricity. It's called pump storage. Now, what are the chances of us building 600 Hoover Dam sized reservoirs in the United States in the next 10 years?
Minimum.
So 0 to 0.
Who will be the first people out protesting building a dam?
The snail darters. So you see that physically what they propose is an impossibility. But it's not just the physical constraints. If you look at what the green movement has meant to the youth of this country. Yeah. Now, in Megan's article, and also in the EIR, Rachel's article from February 15th, goes through the sunrise movement. And you may have heard this debate between Senator Feinstein in California and these 10 and 12-year-olds who are bussed in, and they go, maybe they took Uber to her office or something, but they're in there, and she's actually debating these 12-year-olds and saying, I've been here for 30 years, I know what I'm doing. But then these kids pipe up one after another and say, but we're going to have to face the consequences. If you don't sign on to this Green New Deal, we're going to die. We're going to face disaster. Now, it's not just in the United States. As Helga went through yesterday, you have this Swedish 16-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, who at the age of 11 was so autistic that she convinced her mother. Her mother is an opera singer. And I don't know if Connie has looked at some of her operas or some of her performances, but supposedly she sang some Rossini. But this 11-year-old girl at the time convinced her mother not to take airplanes, not to fly to her opera performances because of the carbon footprint. So this girl is used throughout Europe to get youth to go strike their schools, to walk out of school every Friday, to go to the Parliament House or to the politicians and demand that they do something about climate change. Now, if you look at the effects on the youth, there were reports yesterday that there's a 5-year-old girl in Germany who, I don't know if she told her parents or she told the newspapers, that she said, if they don't do something about climate change by the time I'm 13, I'm going to kill myself. Because if you're told every day that you are just a consumer, that you are just measured by your carbon footprint, that it may be better that you were never born, because your entire existence is just increasing the potential for overheating the planet. Now, this is what our youth have been brainwashed or greenwashed into since they were in kindergarten. And you see the effects of this in the sunrise movement.
Before that, it's even in cartoons. Before kindergarten.
Oh, yeah. Now, I can think back 50 years ago when I was 10 years old. And I was looking at television, but it wasn't cartoons. Not at least at that time. I didn't watch Speed Racer. But in the summer of 1969, I was watching Neil Armstrong take his first steps on the moon. And I was looking at that, and I figured, well, how does that work? And the following fall, that semester, in 5th grade, I actually built a tabletop nuclear power plant with clay and the rods, but I couldn't get a hold of the yellow cake, so I couldn't get it to go critical. But back 50 years ago, the youth were looking at the potential of the space program and what they could do to participate in that. Now, if you look at what the youth should be doing, and by the way, it's obvious now that the Green New Deal is targeting LaRouche's 4 laws. Yeah. Now, I want you to watch a 3-minute video from some scientists in Princeton who we met with, and they go through a proposal for a compact magnetic fusion rocket. And it gives you a sense of what the youth should be looking forward to as their future. And then I'll go on from there. So can you show the video clip?
Yeah, just a sec.
The direct fusion drive is a new concept in propulsion based on fusion energy and it provides in a single package both propulsion and electrical power.
So this direct fusion drive is really a game-changing technology, enabling us to reach deep space destinations much faster and with vast amounts of electric power. NASA's interested in a variety of deep space destinations, such as getting to Jupiter in 1 year, Saturn in 2 years, Pluto in 4 to 5 years. A single DFD engine on the smaller side, so a 1 megawatt DFD engine can do any of those missions. We can literally fly straight to Pluto, fly straight to Jupiter, do not stop, do not pass go, do not collect $200, fly directly to your destination. And that's a dramatically different way to operate deep space missions. It will save time, it will save money, and we'll be able to do more science when we get there.
DFD is still under development at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab.
In DFD, rotating magnetic fields created by antennas on the front and back of the vessel and on top on the bottom create current in the plasma, and that current helps to confine the plasma and to heat the plasma to about 1 billion degrees centigrade. So the purpose of the DFD is to make thrust, but the fusion reactor makes energy. It makes energetic particles. So you have to convert that energy into thrust. We do that by allowing the fusion particles, the fusion products, to pass through the scrape-off layer, heating up the plasma there, and that plasma shoots out the nozzle, generating the thrust.
DFD is different from other fusion concepts because it is much, much smaller.
Ours, which you can see behind here, would be about the size of a minivan.
The current machine, PFRC2, very efficiently heats electrons, and we're upgrading the power supplies so that we can heat ions.
If we can heat the ions in this machine to about 10 million degrees centigrade, we could prove some of the physics theories that have told us we can make a fusion reactor.
A 1 megawatt power plant is ideal for a wide variety of applications. This includes military forward power, remote power, portable power, emergency power, powering mines in the Yukon, and powering spacecraft.
There's a lot of interest in searching for life on Europa, which is one of the moons of Jupiter. We could get there in 1 year with just a single DFD engine.
With a few kilograms of fuel, we'd have enough power for more than 10 years.
We could deflect asteroids that might be coming towards the Earth that would cause major damage. Working on this is very meaningful. The ability to provide power to people on the Earth, the ability to explore the planetary system, to go beyond the planetary system.
We are excited about the future because DFD opens the door to new applications that are not possible today.
And that gives us the opportunity to have constant acceleration. And I just want to touch on that just to give you the idea of what can be done with fusion power. But before that, I just want to go through a little bit of just touch on the basics of fusion. Can you show the different, like helium-3 and tritium? That one.
Oh, okay, that one. Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, which one is on top? Is it
Deuterium, tritium.
deuterium? Okay, that's the typical fuel for a fusion reactor. And you see the input and the output is the reaction products and how much energy is produced in million electron volts. Now, just for comparison, you remember the 1 joule? A electron volt, you could have 10 million trillion electron volts in 1 joule.
Wow.
So it's energy in the very small. But if you see from the nuclear reactions, whether it's deuterium, tritium, or the other one, deuterium, helium-3, where in that reaction you produce positive ions as your reaction products, a nucleus of helium and a proton, which can be controlled by magnetic fields and used as part of your thrust. You see, the output is in the millions of electron volts, whereas if you compare the burning of say, methane or hydrogen gas and oxygen, a chemical reaction you get in the range of 8 to 10 electron volts. So a nuclear reaction gives you 1,000,000 times more energy per reaction than a chemical reaction. And to show that in the very large, to equal the output of one nuclear fission power plant, you would need the equivalent of over 1,000 windmills. And I'm not talking about the water pumping wheel. I'm talking about these giant 300-foot span windmills. And the amount of acreage that the wind farms take up is over 1,000 times that of a nuclear power plant. And the solar panels, it's even worse. So you see the energy density of nuclear fusion reactions is even denser than nuclear fission reactions. Now, because of that density, you can have constant thrust. And just to give you just one example, the speed that you're able to attain is equal to the integral of acceleration times the time in seconds. So if you have a fusion rocket where you can constantly accelerate at 1 Earth gravity, which is equivalent to 9.8 meters per second, which is what you feel every time you walk around. 9.8 meters. If you drop something, it accelerates at 9.8 meters per second squared. Now, if you accelerate at 1 Earth gravity over an entire day, or 86,400 seconds, the speed you attain at the end of that day is 3 million kilometers per hour, or 1.9 million miles an hour. So if you're able to accelerate at constant acceleration, over a few days you can attain the speed to get to Mars. Now, you have to take into consideration, you have to turn around and slow down. The idea is not to reach Mars at 2 million miles an hour. You have to slow down so you can get captured by the gravity of your target planet. So that our ability to get to Mars or to get to an asteroid or a comet that's coming at the Earth, or to power a laser system that you could use to target an asteroid that's coming from the outer solar system. And by hitting it with powerful lasers, you can ablate the surface and cause basically a jet to push that asteroid or comet off course, so it's no longer a threat to hit the Earth head on. So these are the things we can be doing. Now, I can guarantee you that you're not going to accelerate at 1 Earth gravity with windmills. Matter of fact, the windmills don't work too well in space. Although, I don't know, maybe Cortez has a plan for that. But this is what's being worked on right now, not only in Princeton, but there's an operation at Lockheed. There are companies in California and Oregon that are all working on this, but they're all working piecemeal. There's a few $1 million per project. If we were to take the money that we have spent basically connecting the West Texas wind farms with the major cities like Dallas and Houston, we just spent $5 billion building the transmission lines, because there's not too many people in West Texas.
Yeah, right.
So to transmit that power from the windmills to Dallas cost $5 billion just for the transmission lines. If we were to take some of that money and fund a real serious crash effort and combine that with a revival of the NASA space mission, and you may have heard this morning that SpaceX was finally able to get off the ground with a test dummy in their Crew Dragon capsule. Now, there are reports that the dummy was named Ripley, but I think his real name was Obama. But we'll have to see the videos after that. But if you see what happened with that, 8 years ago, me and one of my brothers went, this is when my mother still lived in Florida, we went down there and hijacked her car and took her up with us to the Cape to watch the last shuttle launch. The Atlantis went up in July of 2011. And that was the last shuttle. Now, between that shuttle and the launch this morning of a crew-capable capsule, again, they didn't have any real human beings in it yet. That's supposed to be in the next few months. It took 8 years to get that accomplished. If you remember what we did with Kennedy after his May 25th, 1961 speech to the Congress, where he set the goal to put a man on the moon within 10 years, before the decade is out. It took 8 years from Kennedy's speech, where the biggest rocket was about the size, the capsule was about the size of this podium. It took 8 years to go from these little puny rockets to the massive Saturn V rocket, which to this day is still the biggest rocket ever built. It took 8 years to go from Kennedy's speech to Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. It's taken us 8 years to go from retiring the space shuttle to putting a dummy in low Earth orbit. And people were cheering this. Now, it's good that they made it up there. But I think we can set our goals a little higher than just low Earth orbit. And if you look at what the Chinese have done in landing on the far side of the moon just last month, or back in January, and a program to develop the moon, develop the resources on the moon, which has millions of tons of helium-3 on the surface. You just need to go up there and refine it. If you look at what they're doing and compare it to what we're doing, we're going backwards. And if you look at what Virgin Galactic did last month, where they sent a passenger up, not into orbit, but just to touch the very beginning of space. Not even, the beginning of space is about 100 kilometers up, or 62 miles up. It went about 50 miles up, so you can see the curvature of the Earth. You can go weightless and come back. They did what Alan Shepard did in 1961, in May of 1961, and they claimed that this is a great breakthrough. So we need to get real serious about a real space mission. And if you look at the third panel from our conference, where Keisha and others went through some of this, you get a sense of where we should be going. And if you look at the potential of getting to a new platform of fusion power, and not going backwards to a platform of windmills and solar panels, which we've had windmills for hundreds of years. And besides just producing electricity, we haven't made much progress there. But if we get serious and actually go towards developing fully modular nuclear fission reactors, developing these new fusion concepts, working with China, working with Russia, working with North Korea to get into space, to get a serious space program, that could be the pathway towards peace and collaboration instead of war and hysteria that we get from the Green New Deal. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions on the video or anything else.
Yeah, I think the thing that came to my mind was we need to recruit a lot of teachers. You know, people who are currently employed in the school systems, and just show them that short video, because they have problems getting their kids to concentrate. They have problems, you know, with negativity, as you described in the first part of your speech. You know, causes all kinds of psychological problems in the kids, what's being done to them. And you know, if we could get this stuff even in one school, you know, as a model, you know, it would be dynamite. You know, just to see the progress those children would make.
I think they
Well,
do
you-
have that.
You have to take it from the top, because if you think of what did Kennedy do?
Yeah.
We didn't go to each individual
No,
school
that's
district.
right, but I'm
We
just saying as
set
an
it at the top.
organization.
Yeah, I agree with you. But the other thing I forgot to mention is what Cortez went through is she's 29 years old. And shouldn't hold that against her. But she actually said that, well, us millenniums should not have children. Because not only we can't afford it because of our our school loans that we have to repay. We can't afford housing. But why would you want to bring children into this world when the world is heading for a meltdown? So if that's the outlook of the society,
Right.
then these kids don't have much future. But if you look at the reaction of youth to the landing of Curiosity back just 6-7 years ago, there were actually young people around Times Square watching the landing on the big Sonytron, and they were cheering when it landed. So I don't think we'll have much problem with the youth once they're presented with this. But yeah, we do need to get this into the schools. But we need to have a national, international effort
Absolutely.
to give these kids a future. Because right now, all they have to look forward to is how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint by committing suicide.
But you know, I watch this every Saturday. They have that on NBC. I know you don't like television, but
It depends on what's on. I don't know.
That-
well,
That's
no,
not
they
cocaine.
talk about, you know, that their initiative is pushing education. They have little educational clips and stuff, what you know or what you learn or whatever. And the STEM program, that's why they're trying to encourage girls and young minorities to get involved in science and stuff. So I think that is not the only thing. They are pushing that. It's like, it's all about the monies. You know, if they don't have enough money in the schools or in the budget to educate, and you know, like those KIPP schools, those are like privatized. Like some people can go there, some people can afford it, or depending on how you score, that's how you get in. And they shouldn't have that. They should have that initiative across the board. So I see a lot of this stuff changing in the schools. They give the kids laptops and stuff. It's, you know, it's up to the parents as well to start going to the meetings, pushing certain agendas instead of worrying about who's going to get a parking space. And they need to stop paying these educators more money. And
Yeah,
they
but it's
need-
not about the money.
It is
If you look at what they're being taught as science,
yeah.
science today is climate change. And they're attacking real scientists. Like Trump just appointed a new panel headed by one of our contacts in Princeton, not in the video, but a physicist named William Happer, who is supposed to head up a commission to look at this fraud of climate change. And Happer happens to be a physicist who believes that carbon dioxide is not a poison. It's a good thing. And he's being attacked every day by NPR and the New York Times because he dares to question the religion of climate change. So it's not just about money. It's about what the outlook is. Do you think that man is creative, or do you think that we're just put on here to manage our carbon footprint? So STEM is a fraud. Most of that is to get these kids into little pigeonholes. If you look at the space program, Kennedy didn't say, well, you have to learn science, technology, engineering, and math. He said, we're going to the moon in the next 10 years. And because of that spark, we were able to develop the hundreds of thousands of engineers and technicians who worked on the program. And we were able to accomplish that mission, even though the president was assassinated, and we had the Vietnam War, and we had the race riots and the assassinations. But we were able to accomplish the mission. So it's not just about the money, it's the outlook.
Well, do you think that he's pushed the initiative because of what Ms. Cortez is saying? Because has he been doing this all along since he's been in the office?
Yeah, he did.
That he's just coming up with to get over, because you know how he is.
No, I don't know how he is, but
well,
look.
I don't know anything that comes out of his mouth.
In March of 2017, when the anniversary of Kraft Erica's 100th year, Trump gave a speech about the space program.
Did he write it?
And it was on you can see it on YouTube. It's official. So he's wanted to do this, but you look at what he has around him. He has traitors like Vice President Pence and the Secretary of State, Pomposo, who's threatening the Philippines, who's threatening China, who's threatening Venezuela. And if we liberate Trump from this witch hunt, we can actually get him to focus on what's necessary. Because his intent is to go with a real program. And he got us out of this ridiculous Paris Accord, which is a fraud. The fact that you have National Academy of Sciences promoting this is an embarrassment. And when you have real scientists and real physicists like Walter Cunningham, who's an astronaut, he wasn't a dummy, he was an astronaut who went on the Apollo 7. Now, this was the first manned Apollo shot after 3 of his colleagues were burnt on the ground. So it's not like a joyride. These people were taking their lives in their hand. And he is a physicist, and he was scheduled to speak at our conference, but he's spoken repeatedly on the fraud of this carbon dioxide mafia. And he said, I watched one of his recent videos, and he said that on the spacecraft, you have monitors to detect the level of carbon dioxide. Because we exhale carbon dioxide. If you don't treat it and remove it from the atmosphere of the capsule, the carbon dioxide will replace the oxygen. And if you just have carbon dioxide to breathe, you're not going to live very long. You're not a plant. And he said that the monitors in the capsule are set to go off when you reach 3,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide to the rest of the atmosphere in the capsule. And now in the atmosphere, we're worried about 400 parts per million. Wow. And in nuclear submarines that go underwater for over 3 months, 6 months at a time, their alarms are set to 5,000 parts per million. Wow. So this whole religion about getting rid of carbon dioxide is a fraud. And the fact that the president has empowered a panel to expose this fraud is a good first step. What he should do is exonerate LaRouche and bringing in some of Lucia's collaborators to map out how we're going to implement these 4 laws.
Yeah.
And if that was done, we'd have kids beating down the door to join with the program.
Yep. Okay. Now, is this the same carbon that they want you to put the thing up in your house? You know, if you have.
Oh no, that's carbon monoxide.
Oh, okay.
Carbon dioxide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, carbon monoxide. Now,
I didn't do well in chemistry.
The environmental
well, that's all right.
happy
You can.
to double the carbon monoxide in the atmosphere. It's like that.
They gave me my G and I was glad to get it.
Now, you can see the level
Okay.
of knowledge of chemistry. It was, whenever we have a blackout in a hurricane,
Yeah.
what happens is people go out and they buy these
Oh, yeah.
generators.
Did you see all those people that died in the project? I mean, the 2 people. They
Well,
went to the
what
whole
what
project.
people do is they bring the generator to their patio,
Right. In Baltimore.
and the carbon monoxide, which is generated by the burning, comes in, and they come in, and every time there's a blackout, a major blackout, you have whole families that are wiped out.
Hey, Joel, I had a question because I was just brought to my attention. You might know a little bit more about it. Energy Secretary Rick Perry had announced that the Department of Energy is moving toward building the VTR, which is versatile fast neutron source or versatile test reactors, as a part of the Trump administration's plan to revitalize and expand the U.S. nuclear industry. Do you know more about that?
Yeah. See, that's supposed to go into the Idaho National Laboratory. Now, I think this is before you came around, but in the early 2000s, we had a test reactor in Washington State that produced fast or high energy neutrons in a reactor. Under George Bush, they decommissioned the reactor. This is in 2003 to 2005. And this reactor had a molten salt core, so it was a very advanced reactor. We drained the salt, the molten salt, and we drilled a hole through the reactor vessel so it can never be used again. So what Rick Perry proposed is good, but it's supposed to come online in 2025, which is 20 years after we drilled the hole in the last vessel. So it's a step in the right. We're not going backwards. We're going forwards, but we've killed 20 years because of this hysteria against nuclear power.
You think he should be in that position?
Perry?
Yes.
If he's moving in that direction, then why not?
Well, if he takes the right advice, look. Under Obama, we had 2 top nuclear physicists as the head of the Department of Energy. But what did they do? They promoted declaring carbon dioxide as a pollutant. They went along with the Paris Accord. So while one of these physicists had a Nobel Prize for using lasers to slow down particles so you can cool them to almost absolute zero. So these weren't stupid people, but they went along with the group think, or after Me Too, it's now grope think. So they had high degrees, but they went along with a backward program. So Perry, while I think he studied agriculture at A&M, besides being a cheerleader. He was part of a cheerleader. But at least he's going in the right direction. These other great physicists were going along with the program and taking us backwards.
Now, do you think they're worried because, is this the same thing like the Chernobyl thing where they're, are these the same gases or they're 2 different things?
No,
Where
they're-
that's radiation and all of that.
As bad as Chernobyl was, and Chernobyl was an accident that occurred because that reactor did not have a containment, no home and they were running experiments on it and it had a bad design. But even as bad as that accident was, the number of people killed from that accident was about 50. We lost, in the last few weeks, 50 people just from natural gas explosions. There was an apartment building in Paris, in the middle of Paris. It blew up. And they thought, oh, this must be terrorism. But no, it was a natural gas leak.
Oh my God. Somebody hit them.
There was a overpressure near Boston a few months ago. And you have to pump the gas into each household at a certain pressure. And somebody turned a knob and it was overpressure. And it blew out whole neighborhoods. And some kid who had just gotten his driver's license, like 16, and he was parked outside his house, and his house blew up, and the chimney fell on the car, and he was the only one killed in the accident. But if you look at the number of people killed in coal mine disasters, and I remember I took a nuclear engineering course in college. And the professor kept saying that there are more people killed from burning coal because of the uranium is in the coal. So if you're worried about radiation, you get more radiation from burning coal than from living near a nuclear reactor. And if you look at Fukushima, to this day, they have attributed the Fukushima meltdown with one person who had some kind of cancer they attributed to him working in the cleanup. 18,000 people were killed by the tsunami. Hundreds of people were killed because they had to move. They had these people in these old home nursing homes. And if you're 85 or 90, and you're forced to move into a new location, your chance of survival is greatly diminished. So hundreds of people died from just the evacuation. And if you look at 3 Mile Island, nobody died. Zero. Nobody died from that so-called accident.
We used to say more people died in the backseat of Teddy Kennedy's car than died in that accident.
Which is true.
Now, what about the soil? Have they ever tested that to see? I know at one point they had where stuff was growing abnormal and all of that.
And where, Chernobyl or?
No, I mean, have they ever tested the soil?
Well, yeah, they tested Chernobyl, and because of the evacuation zone, they go back into the and they find that it's like a Garden of Eden now. Because people were forced to move out, the wildlife has come back and occupied that area. So you have wolves and deer and all sorts of birds. And to this day, they haven't found a bird with three wings.
Oh.
So there's this inordinate fear of radiation. Now, every time you go on an airplane, you get more radiation than if you lived for 30 years around a nuclear plant.
Joel, can you say something about the dangers of privatization of aerospace and space? For example, the Challenger accident, there's this famous O-ring. Now, to my knowledge, that was caused by a private company or an outsourcing, which is a practice of privatization. And also, the SpaceX has had huge failures in their rocket program. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, on the Challenger, it wasn't privatization. And the NASA has used private companies to build equipment. NASA didn't build the Saturn V. They had contractors, but they oversaw the contractors. Now, what happened with the O-ring was the company that built the solid rocket boosters the engineers had warned that the O-rings were not rated for freezing temperatures. And because the FBI, I don't think it was under McCabe or any of his cronies, but this is back in the 85, they targeted the head of NASA and forced him to resign. So he was replaced by this, basically a glorified accountant. And so the accountant was in charge of giving a go, no go to this launch. And all up through the line, they were saying that no, do not launch in these conditions. And because he was trying to impress, the president was going to give the State of the Union that evening, and they gave the go-ahead for the launch. And within 72 seconds, because of the cold conditions, the O-ring failed, and you had the Challenger blow up. So it wasn't directly privatization. Now, as far as SpaceX, now it's good that they got the launch with that dummy up there this morning. But the fact that it took us 8 years from the launch of the last space shuttle to the launch of this test capsule is an indictment on this idea. Now, NASA was preparing a follow-on to the space shuttle. And in 2010, he'll go nameless, but a certain president went to Cape Canaveral, canceled that follow-on, and canceled the mission to go back to the moon, and said that to the NASA audience, I'm surprised they weren't throwing tomatoes and grenades at him at this time. But he said to this NASA audience that we don't need to go to the moon. We've been there. We've done that. Could you imagine if Columbus had taken the first trip to the Caribbean and said, well, we discovered everything we need to know, so we don't need to come back. Yeah. So the privatization is a result of the decisions made in 2010. Now, SpaceX could be incorporated into a larger mission, but I can guarantee you SpaceX and Bozo and Bezos are not going to get us to Mars because they're still working on the chemical rocket designs that we had 50 years ago. So it's not a bad thing that private companies, I mean, Lockheed Martin built the space probe that's orbiting Jupiter, and they built the probe that just landed on Mars recently, the InSight. But they built it under contract with NASA. So if you have NASA overseeing the operation, that'll work. But if you depend on individuals paying millions of dollars to go on a joyride in low Earth orbit, then it's going to be a mission to nowhere.
Right. That's like
Mark hold on one second. Mark has a question.
Have any private space companies achieved escape velocity? I mean, or are they just orbital?
Yeah, I think the super heavy SpaceX, remember it went up with a Tesla? And it's it went so it's escaped and it's now orbiting the sun.
Okay, I think that's a dodge by Elon Musk to increase the mileage statistics, his cafe mileage statistics.
Yeah, it could be.
But they're electric vehicles, so you know.
It's going to be solar powered soon.
I see. Okay.
So Joel.
Yes.
I have a leaflet for those who've not seen it on the, not to change the subject because the question of the Russians running the hacking of the DNC emails, but it is a question of science and the hysteria that has been going on for 2 years of Russiagate. I have a leaflet I'll hand out to the people who have not seen it, but maybe you want to just incorporate that in terms of what Bill Binney Larry Johnson and the VIPs have done scientifically, right, with forensic evidence to prove that the Russians could not have hacked the emails.
Yeah, if you haven't seen the Bill Benny's presentation, it's in the latest EIR, his presentation in the first panel of our conference. What he goes through is that there are certain protocols for transferring files. And to transfer a file onto a thumb drive, there's something called file allocation tables, where as you're transferring the data, you stamp the time, and this particular program stamps the time to the nearest even number, so that in any of these digital files, you have a 0, 1, odd or even. And if it's just random, like when you're transmitting over the internet, you have a 50-50 chance of it being a 0, 1, or odd or even. But if you're transferring to a thumb drive, because of the way that the file is written, it's 100% that it will be an even number in the timestamp. And what Benny went through, he went through the files that were posted on WikiLeaks that supposedly came from the Russians through Roger Stone. Although he doesn't speak Russian now. But he said that the file allocation tables from what was on the internet indicated that they were all even numbers, and he looked at 500 examples. So if you have a binary system, it's 0 or 1, so it's base 2 to the 500 power, which is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. And in the base 10, it's like 10 to the 150 power. Now, a billion is 10 to the 9. A quadrillion is 10 to the 15. So you're talking about 10 to the 150. That's a big number. That's huge. So the chances of it being something that was hacked, as opposed to somebody just sticking a thumb drive in a computer and it was an inside leak, the chances of it being a hack are 0 or 1 over 2 times 500, or 2 to the 500 power. Now, have you heard that on MSNBC or even Fox?
Yep. No.
They can get their binary numbers right.
Or maybe we should give one to Cortez, since she's obviously smarter than Einstein.
Yeah.
I have a question. So it occurs to me that the wind energy is not stable, right? Because it depends on the lateral. So is it possible for scientists to design the windmill more pretty and set up the windmill farm as the tourist destination? So then it's possible for children to get some knowledge there, or for people to have a trip there, and when they get good, when they see the good thing at the same time, and then they can get some knowledge about wind energy, and it also can increase the income of the windmill farm, because it needs a lot of money to run the farm if it's not stable.
Well, you see, the way they sell it is that once you build a windmill, then the wind is free.
Yeah.
But how much does it cost to build a 300-foot windmill? And these are huge.
Yeah, we've seen them in Dallas.
Now, how much steel, how much carbon? And by the way, the blades are made of carbon fibers. And the bearings are high precision bearings. And some of the contractors, like General Electric, Mitsubishi. Now, the other thing I forgot to mention about the electric system is that you plug it into the wall and you have an alternating current that's going 60 cycles a second. If you introduce a system that is erratic or unstable, you have to take additional measures to stabilize that, because if you introduce a current that is out of phase with the 60 cycles, you can set up interferences that would collapse the whole grid, which it's come close to that. So windmills are a negative energy factor, because I'll give you this, when they are running, what happens is because of the push for renewable energy from George W. Bush to Cortez, if the wind is blowing, then you have to match what's produced with the load. You can't store electricity very easily. So if your load is low, say at night, you have to shut off other sources of power, like nuclear power plants, coal plants, which are not designed to be turned on and off like a light switch. So what happens, because you're producing electricity in the middle of the night in these windmills, you have to shut off your base load of nuclear, coal, even natural gas. And if you have a plant that is not producing power, then you're not making money on that plant. And because you're not making money, we have shut down 6 nuclear power plants in the last 5 years because they were forced to shut down when the windmills were generating power. So what we should do with these wind farms is turn them into Don Quixote
Theme parks.
theme parks. There's very little use that you can get from these wind farms. By the way, if you look at the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, they give you tables on how much power is produced by the different producers in the state. And I remember looking in August a few years ago when we had 108 degrees, and the peak load was at 5 o'clock, from 5 to 6 o'clock that hour. And if you look at what was produced, you had the nuclear power plant at near Fort Worth and the one at Bay City, and you had the coal power plants and the natural gas. The windmills during that hour were producing 1% of the power used in that hour. So wind power is actually a negative. It's not only useless, it's a detriment to the overall power.
Because utilities will gladly buy wind power at a loss so that they can collect federal subsidies. Yeah?
Well, and it's even worse than that. What they do is that because it was deregulated, if you buy power from, say, a nuclear plant at $30 a megawatt, because it's deregulated, if there happens to be a heat wave, then the utilities can charge what the market will bear. So that $30 per megawatt hour, in that hour, because people need the power, can go up to $3,000 a megawatt hour. So that's why your electric bills have been going up. And if all you have to do is look at Germany, which is in the process of shutting down all of their nuclear plants and intend on shutting down their coal plants over the next 10 years. They have their own Cortez over there called Angela Merkel. She's the prime minister. But if you look at the cost of energy per kilowatt hour in Germany, it's 3 times that of France. And it's 3 times that of the United States. And the only reason why you haven't had blackouts in Germany is when they need the power, they buy it from France, which produces 80% nuclear power. Or they buy it from Switzerland. Or they buy it from Poland, which produces 80% from coal. So the carbon, if they're so worried about carbon, the carbon footprint of Germany has gone up since they've implemented these green policies.
What about those windmills in Holland? What were they used for?
Oh, that was to pump water.
Oh, is that why they were blowing?
Yeah, there was. So windmills in the 1600s, they were useful, but we don't want to go back to the covered wagons because they were useful.
No, I was just saying, what is the difference between them?
Yeah, they just pump water.
Oh.
Joel, would you go through that again? Because I think it was really important what you said about how the windmills forced the other kinds of electric generation to be shut down.
Yeah.
Because
because of the way that renewable energy has been pushed. It's the law in many states, including deep red Texas. You'd think we wouldn't have any greenies here, but we had one in the Bush family, including his father and son. But if you look at the way the law is written, if you're producing power from windmills, and so far in Texas it's mostly windmill energy. They haven't shut down the farms to put solar panels in yet. But because of the way the law is written, if the windmill is producing power, the utilities have to buy the power from the windmill. And because the way the grid is set up, that you cannot have more power produced than your load. It has to be balanced.
Is the load the amount you're using?
Yes. So that if you're getting, say, 50% of your power from the windmills, then if you keep the nuclear plant open and you keep the coal power plant open, you may have 150% of the load being applied to the power grid. Now that power has to go somewhere. And if it's not being used, then it will start to trip the circuit breakers. And if you don't trip the circuit breakers to prevent an overload, you may damage the transformers. And some of these transformers take about a year to build. And we don't build them in the United States. So you could blow out the grid for a year. So because of that requirement, you have to shut down the nuclear plant. And because the way they set up the financing, if you're not producing kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, then that plant is earning the utility that owns it $0. So that plant, while it's perfectly safe, perfectly ready to go, it becomes a deficit to the utility. And they look at the numbers and say, well, we can get this almost free energy from the windmills. Why should we keep operating? We have to have the people monitoring the control panels. We have to have people on site. We can just lay those people off and shut down the plant. And we can just depend on the windmill energy. But what happens when you have a polar vortex and the windmills freeze up? So because of the push for renewable, and this is where I disagree with Rick Perry's recent statement. He said, oh, we want all of the above. Wind, solar, nuclear, gas. It's just, tolerating this renewable, the only renewable power is nuclear. Both fission and fusion, because you can recycle whatever so-called waste you have.
So what's the big deal? Why come they don't want it, if that's the better?
Well, that goes back to what Megan has and what Rachel touched on in her article, that the intent is to reduce the carrying capacity of your society. Schellenhuber, who's the German, who was the advisor to the Pope, and people all upset about the Pope tolerating these pederasts in the church. Well, his encyclical, which I read in 2015, is screwing the whole world because he's worshiping Mother Earth, and he's one of the most, he's right up there with Cortez as far as a greenie.
There's a place in hell for him too.
Well, yeah, if he doesn't repent.
Yeah, he said repent.
I wanted to make a point going back to what Victor was saying about private industry. Because I think, you know, that we used to make a bigger deal about it in terms of what would be the effect of these big projects, you know, spearheaded by the federal government, but hiring private industry, because that's you know what built the what do you call it, the airplane industry was the war mobilization, you know, and you don't have to do that for a war. You can do it for peace and development, you know, with the federal government laying down the program. You know, this is what we need to build the country, and we're gonna put a lot into that, but you know, we want to have all these private companies involved because you've got the experience, you know how to do this stuff. And
well, it wasn't just the war program. If you look at the history of civil aviation, what happened is you had the Wright brothers, and it took years before their flight was really recognized. And it wasn't until World War I where you had these planes being developed in Europe, but the U.S. was way behind, that we set up the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was the precursor to NASA. And what happened is you had all these private little companies, the Wright brothers, the Curtiss company, all these companies building their own little airplane, and they were suing each other because of patent infringements. It wasn't the Chinese stealing patents, it was internal. And what the US government did is they stepped in and they said, we're gonna buy all the patents and we're gonna give contracts for you to build certain aircraft, and to advance the state of the art, we're going to invest in this National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. We're going to build wind tunnels, and this is what the, if you saw Hidden Figures,
oh yeah,
this is what a lot of them were involved with before NASA. So we were developing the latest technology in these wind tunnels, and we were giving that technology to different private contractors like Boeing, Lockheed, to develop the engine, the aircraft. And before the Second World War, what happened is that the US Postal Service gave contracts to these companies to fly airmail routes. So before passenger service, there was the US Postal Service, which invested in these private companies to literally get them off the ground. And once the World War II started, we had this set up so that we could develop these private companies to build the airplanes we needed for the war effort.
yeah, I wasn't just talking about airplanes. You know, I mean, the thing is, my main point was the idea of how the federal government drives, you know, the private sector, you know,
Right.
by its orientation, like NWAPA. I mean, imagine what that would do in terms of steel production and, you know.
or the railroads.
Yeah.
People forget the Lincoln set up the transcontinental railroad in the middle of the Civil War.
Right.
And it was finished from 1862 to 1869 when they put the Golden Rail in Utah. It took 7 years to build a transcontinental railroad, coming from both West Coast and the East Coast, and they had to line up. Otherwise, they would have to start over. But if you look at the only good thing that you can possibly indicate from the Green New Deal is what was mentioned in our conference as well. They want to build high-speed rail. Well, we've been building a high-speed rail from Houston to Dallas since 1990.
Really?
And how many miles of track have been laid?
Joel?
Yes.
I mean, two things. One, you may have mentioned this earlier, but this new commission that Trump's forming on climate change could be a real kind of eye-opener, and it could kind of lift the cloud, so to speak, and allowing people to think again about what this all this nonsense has been about. But I wanted to otherwise ask you about this new fast neutron test reactor. Perry.
Keisha asked about it.
Oh, did she?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Well, just to repeat that, you probably remember this in Hanford in the 2005 period. We had a high-speed neutron test facility at Hanford. And this was under George W. Bush. They went in, they drained the coolant, the molten salt, and they drilled through the vessel.
Oh, yeah, so you couldn't use it again.
So they could never use it again. So it's good that Perry is establishing this new fast neutron test facility, but it's supposed to come online in 2025, 20 years after we shut down the last one.
Why so long?
Because we have defunded nuclear research, not just fusion, but the modular nuclear reactors. We've defunded real science, and we've funded climate change. Yeah. Climate change is the new science. And on this new panel, I mentioned that Happer, if you look at the New York Times, NPR, every day now they're attacking Happer by name. And they're saying, look at this foolishness. Everybody knows, according to the great climate scientists like Bernie Sanders, that the science debate is over, that climate change is real, according to the U.S. Senate. And why are we putting this foolish retired physicist in charge of looking at what's already established science? So it's like the Roman Empire saying that we don't need to fund astronomy. We know how the orbits of the planets go because we have Ptolemy.
Joe, can I say something? Go ahead. So the idea is that you can't. The idea used to be, and the truth is, that man can solve any of these problems on resources or population or anything else with science, with creativity and with science. But if you think about the last 30 years, that's been turned on its head to say, no, science is where all of our problems are coming from. We have nuclear radiation, we have climate change, we have this, we have that. If you have more science, you have more problems. And if you have more people, you have more problems. That's what people get told over and over and over again these days.
Well, and also they get told that the only real science is climate change.
Yeah. It's a science that proves that science is
the only science you get paid for doing, at least.
That's more like it. And once you get people to agree to that, then the idea that you're going to lower the number of people on the planet drastically is part of what you're accepting.
Right. That's why Cortez, if you look at her Instagram, and if you you should listen to her. I meant to get an audio, but I didn't get. But if you listen to her, she sounds like a 12-year-old valley girl. And she says, "Oh, we're screwed." But if you have that that attitude, you why would you have children? Now, to go beyond it, she's not the brains of the outfit.
Clearly.
If you look at, I mentioned Schellenhuber, and Schellenhuber said that besides pushing this climate change agenda onto the Vatican and in Germany, that he says, well, the carrying capacity of the Earth is just 1 billion people. So we had a table outside, what was it, in Washington Park in New York, in Manhattan.
In NYU.
And yeah, nearby, and it was called, we had the LaRouche pack table and we had the Lemming pack table. Lemmings, like, you know, lemmings going over the cliff. It's a good wind over the cliff. But and we had a form that said, okay, fill out the form for which of your relatives is going to be eliminated because we don't have the carrying capacity for all these people. But this steeps the culture. But if you've ever read the Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code, and his latest novel is called Inferno.
Yeah.
Basically based on Dante's Inferno. But the theme is you have a mad scientist who's creating a new virus that he's going to unleash on the world. And what does this virus do? It sterilizes 1/3 of the population so that it'll begin to reduce the population so that we can get to that level. Because these guys, they don't want to be called mass murderers. They don't want to kill people. They just want to prevent the population from reproducing itself.
Some of them anyway. I don't know about all of them.
Well, some, yeah, if you look at the royal family, they keep having,
I think they enjoy it.
they have three, 4 kids.
Yeah, right.
Well, Kate's going to have a
Joe, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on what the commission that Trump administration has put in place to help with inform people about this climate change hoax going on. What exactly is their agenda? Where are they right now? And what are the goals that they are planning to achieve?
Yeah, as far as I see, he's already appointed this physicist from Princeton, William Happer, to head up this commission. Now, what it's labeled as is they used to have the Team A and Team B for the CIA. And Team A would give an estimate of what's going to happen to the Soviet Empire in the 70s. And you would have another group of Team B, which would come in and look at the same information and criticize the conclusions of Team A. Well, this Happer Commission, which is supposedly already impaneled, and they haven't released the names of all of the members because they don't want them to be targeted by the news. But the intent, as far as I know, is for them to look at some of the material that was presented at our conference in New Jersey just 2 weeks ago, where we have people like Thomas Weissmuller and Larry Bell from the University of Houston, and real scientists like Walter Cunningham, who's trained as a physicist and astronaut. And look at what they're saying, compare it to this hysteria from the Schellenhuber and these people, and criticize it point for point. Because if you look at what the media is saying about Happer, they're saying This guy is so crazy. Not only is he a climate change denier, he says that CO2 is good for the planet. What kind of fool is that?
Photosynthesis.
Guy's gonna save their ass.
Yeah, so as far as I know, that panel has been put together, but it's being attacked daily.
Yeah.
But if you were to look at the real data on what the temperature changes, and climate changes all the time, but this hysteria that the only thing controlling the climate is carbon dioxide is a fallacy from the very beginning, because the most powerful greenhouse gas is water vapor. So maybe Cortez should ban water vapor.
You mean chemtrails?
Now, my second concern is with all the resources available with the oil industry, how come they remain almost quiet, or they have been shut down almost completely by this climate change group who has moved on with the disinformation year after year, and now they have started a grassroots work coming up, and within a generation this host will have ground, and it will take many more generations to come to change it. Why is the oil industry, with all the resources that they have at hand, and seeing that their industry is being destroyed, more or less, they remain almost powerless so far?
Well, if you look at who controls the oil companies, like the Rockefeller family, you know that the Rockefeller family is the biggest shareholder of Exxon. And every shareholder meeting, you have the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of John Rockefeller demanding that they keep the oil in the ground. So what's happening is we're still using 100 million barrels a day of oil. And we're still discovering oil and coming up with new ways to extract oil. But if you look at who has controlled the oil industry, from Royal Dutch Shell to the Rockefeller family, that they don't particularly care. As a matter of fact, British Petroleum, controlled by the British, was trying to change its name to Beyond Petroleum. And Exxon is actually financing using microbes to create oil that they can put in jet airplanes. Now that's like using windmills to produce electricity. It's a step backward. So the leadership of these oil companies, people like Tillerson, what have they done the last 10, 20 years? Tillerson reduced the revenue of Exxon by 50%, and he took whatever profits they were generating to buy Exxon stock, which has collapsed by 50%. So we don't have a bunch of geniuses running these oil companies. And as LaRouche said in the past, we should use oil for a feedstock. We shouldn't be using these huge tankers to transport fuel all over the country. Now they're transporting liquid natural gas or pressurized gas all over the country, all over the world. I mean, we could use, there's nothing wrong with oil, but there's just like nothing wrong with a fireplace. But you're not going to advance your society by using wood. And we do have to go beyond petroleum, but not with solar panels and windmills.
That's good. On that point, Joe, I just want to re-emphasize to people, because the point that you just made gets us at the role that everybody has to play, especially people who know something about this field. Our EIR, Executive Intelligence Committee, Executive Intelligence Review publication. The recent one is titled Courage Will Change the Future. And first of all, I'm holding this up, this EIR, because if you are, and people online should see this too. Courage should change the future. Beautiful picture of Rembrandt. If you don't know who that painter artist is, that is a self-portrait of Rembrandt. Anyway, I'm bringing this up because first of all, everyone should be subscribed to the Executive Intelligence Review. It will very much enhance your critical thinking, your reasoning, ability to think outside of the bombardment of what's going on with the, they don't need to see me. Anyway, what's going on with the media. And particularly this EIR has the entirety, the next two of them, this one and the next one to come after, will have the entirety of the proceedings of the conference that the Schiller Institute held in New Jersey, and the beautiful presentations that were just brought up earlier. But I just wanted to bring this up because people should be a subscriber to it. You can be a subscriber on a daily alert service of EIR for just $100 a month. You can get our full online publication, and you can talk to your representatives here about how to get that, or you can go to LaRouche Pub and sign up for the EIR if you're watching online. But I just thought I'd bring this up because this is what we're really the question at hand. Courage will change the future. The question is, people know this is a threat to the existence of mankind. Are you going to go along with it, or are you going to actually show courage and fight against it? Because the future of mankind, the future of the next generations unborn, the targeting on our young people, and I think Joel just expressed what we have in front of us as a beautiful future that can be brought about if we choose to fight. And you know, you think about it, in 5 months we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission. All right, Joe, you were talking about that earlier. And they're, you know, this year they put out the movie on Neil Armstrong, the first man. They're going to be doing a new documentary on Apollo 11. And it's not just about reminiscing on the past, about what the accomplishments we made. And think about it, if we had what they're talking about doing today, ending carbon footprints and all of this craziness, you think we would have gotten to the moon? You think we would have had the Saturn V rocket if these guys had gotten away with what they're doing now? Had the optimism for the younger generations that Joe was talking about? No way. And so the question right now is not just to look at 50 years past, but look into 50 years into the future. Where are we going from here? And use the inspiration of the moon landing, of what drove the optimism of our young people, not what said, you know, which was really devastating to hear Joel talk about the young lady who, I mean, the young child, excuse me. 5-year-old who, you know, was talking about by the time they're 12, if we don't do something about carbon emissions, then they might kill themselves. I mean, what kind of society are we living in? This is a real bestial dark age society. So you don't have any choice to sit back and just wait and see what's going to happen, or say, well, it's not the popular thing to do to go against this, because you have to be unpopular, you have to show courage, and we have to actually defeat this thing. So I didn't mean to take over, Joe, but I just wanted to bring that up.
I endorse that message.
Joel, going back to nuclear power for a second.
Yes, let's go back to nuclear.
It's been proven pretty well that it can follow loads as well as any other energy source. Is that right?
No, what you have is the nuclear power and the coal are your base load. Mm-hmm. So it provides the power 24/7, as they say. Yeah. So it's there as your base, so it operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you need to refuel, so its availability is about 90-95% now from nuclear power plants.
So those can be planned outages?
Yes, they're planned a year and a half in advance. So that's your base. You want to keep that on at all times. And when you have a heat wave, then you bring online the natural gas turbines that you can fire up. And you bring those as your backup. You don't want to use the nuclear plants as your peak load because of the bulk of these plants. You can't just shut it down and then turn it back on. It's a whole procedure, including safety steps. So the nuclear plants are your base load, and everything else is just for peak load.